Dave Polton is my name, and I have a question for all three of you, actually, and it comes from one of Craig's ladder slides on the new wetland policy, which is this very vague objective that is stated in the policy, and we've heard in various areas of Alberta policy that there's a real reluctance to commit to a no net loss goal, or in many cases to a specific goal overall. And I would just like to hear from the three of you, I guess, on the viability of these types of policies in the absence of a specific measurable goal.
Don't all jump in at once.
Always point to the regulator.
Don't all jump in at once. Yeah, the question of no net loss is a difficult one, and as I think I mentioned in the talk, we were quite surprised when it showed up in the Act about no net loss, and we sat around looking at our navel saying, well, who actually came up with that? Realizing that trying to ensure that you have no net loss when we didn't have the processes or techniques in place to be able to actually measure what no net loss was in regards to function or the benefits that came out from it. So we realized we're still efficient in that, determining what no net loss of. We can do area, we can look at area. We can look at particular types of functions that when we do compensation or minimizations. But for us at this point in time to be able to say, have we achieved no net loss of area and function? We can't say that. So it's a difficult part for us in trying to actually realize the objective that was put forward in the Act and then in our policy itself. What we are striving to do, as Dennis was talking about, was we're trying to be adaptable and trying to work with what we actually have on the landscape and what we have available to us for restoration opportunities, as well as what can actually be available for creation, to essentially say what may be necessary within a watershed where we've had significant loss in the past, what type of functions may be actually necessary, whether it's for stormwater retention, flood control, wildlife habitat, or so forth.
Thanks, Dave. And we had in the draft stages of the Alberta policy commented on that as a worthy goal, and I don't know really the answer to the ultimate question of why it wasn't adopted. I do think, though, that the more sort of practical functioning of the policy is around the ratios of replacement, so I suspect that those are more operationally significant than the overarching goal of no net loss.
And I would just like to say, from the United States experience, a lot of places, I know in California we actually had a policy of no overall net loss. And by stating that, we put it into the realm of the functional assessment type approach. And the other thing I would say is every region's different that I found. And I've had the opportunity to work all over the United States, including up in Alaska. And there are times where a program of maybe preservation may have a greater watershed benefit if you have a regional plan. So I think regional planning is the best way to go for wetlands. US EPA has a process called SAMP, which is Special Area Management Plans, to develop wetland regional plans. And that has allowed the flexibility to go out of kind, to allow preservation when they typically use no net loss. If you have a situation where you can identify the key wetlands you want to keep and the numbers to get there. So that may be something to look at. But no net loss is a very heavy thing to bear, and it really, how active people are they going to be to really protect that and implement that policy is the bigger question.
Thank you.
Hi, Todd Zimmerling with the Alberta Conservation Association. This last question actually really tweaked a lot of interest to mine because I've been thinking about this myself. In the reading I've done on conservation offsets, whether they be wetlands, terrestrial, most of the reviews of these processes generally show that no net loss is not being achieved, no matter where you're going in the world, unless you're being very specific. Like we had 6 toads, we want to make sure we still have 6 toads, so there's no net loss. So I guess I wanted to ask the panel members that, do you think maybe we should be looking at throwing out the terminology completely, instead going with something more along the lines of best alternative outcome? If you avoided the development in the first place, that would be the best outcome, therefore you have no impact. But given that you do a development, what's the best alternative outcome from an ecological standpoint? And that way we avoid these issues that tend to take years to develop the process of how we're going to measure everything and how we're going to make sure we got everything as opposed to being much simpler using KISS and just go with the best alternative outcome. So I guess I'd like your comments on that.
I'll go last this time.
Okay, good. I think Craig will be the person with the most insight on this, but I would reiterate what he said with regard to the flexibility. We certainly feel strongly that the policies around mitigation should be flexible enough to allow the offset monies to be spent in the place where they'll have the most positive ecological impact, and that may or may not be beside the area where the damage took place. I was struck by Craig's slides with the mitigation sites buried in a suburban neighborhood. Those will probably have very little ecological function, and certainly in terms of wildlife, given the surrounding development, and I think that's the sort of outcome you want to avoid with some flexibility that looks at things like the productivity of the soils and the general biodiversity opportunities you have in some areas in Alberta within the white zone that you may not have within the green zone. So mitigation on a site for the sake of mitigation certainly is not the preferred outcome in my mind.
Yeah, and I would say that I actually agree with you. I like the use of the greatest conservation benefit or greatest conservation outcome. And again, those are perfect examples. I can show you awful looking wetlands that meet the no net loss provisions under the wetland training that I went through. And 10,000, 20,000, I don't know how many wetland scientists certified in the United States we have today, but would all come up to the same basic conclusion within 5 to 10% standard of error. And yet they suck. They really are bad wetlands. But they meet no net loss. They meet the standard of which I was trained. But I, as someone who really care about environmental outcomes, even though I'm a business person, I want to see good environmental outcomes. And so I think we need to have a system that looks at best conservation benefits, and that may mean looking at something that may have greater buffers related to rather than just meeting the no net loss in terms of the waters aspect. So these are various things. That's why I'm such a big believer in watershed planning, regional planning, ecosystem planning to decide where you want to go. How much is enough? Where do you want to go?
Actually, I think when we look at it from my own perspective within the province that we work in, I think perhaps we are moving toward the greatest conservation outcome, because as we realize we do not have the process in place to actually measure no net loss in function and actually be able to put it back within the watershed. So we're actually looking what are the opportunities to provide certain functions within an area. So what is going to be the greatest benefit that we can actually receive from the restoration activity that is underway or the compensation project that is required. So again, that's looking at it from a watershed basis. We're actually move compensation money and projects from one watershed to the next, realizing saying where we get our best bang for the dollar, or where the company that is actually doing the compensation project for the third party is actually established an area that has been approved for restoration. And what are the opportunities there for restorations? What are the benefits that are coming out from that restoration activity? So are we actually achieving a no net loss of function actually within the watershed itself? Not necessarily. Are we actually increasing or getting a no net loss where we actually might get a net gain on certain types of wetlands where we actually have our compensation ratios? But we may not be the same function. So I guess when we're looking at it, we probably are moving towards the whole question of, or option of greatest conservation outcome that we could possibly get through a mitigative procedure.
Okay. Any other questions? Here we go. One,
Do you
please.
still have time for one more?
Yes.
Noreen Ambrose with Cows and Fish. I think the last couple questions brought up some interesting comments about sort of looking at the bigger picture, not just the individual site, and certainly, Craig, your comments about sometimes they just suck, even though they're officially okay. If we look at it bigger...
Is that a scientific term, officially suck? I'm going to look that up. I'll get back to you. Okay.
Yeah. If we look at wetland banking, wetland restoration mitigation, sort of more broadly in terms of the whole watershed, what are the weaknesses as well as the sort of the good things that if we aren't going to apply it on site, if we're going to apply it to other kinds of water bodies, we've mostly, I would say, in Alberta are thinking small lentic, non-flowing water bodies. What about lakes? What about streams? What about rivers? If we're looking at overall function, how do we start to look at them together?
Randall?
Yeah, I was going to say that is a difficult question, particularly when the regulations. In some ways, where we actually have our regulation under the Environment Act where it deals actually with water, we probably could apply it irregardless of whether it's a wetland per se or whether it is a river or rather waterway per se. So I guess we're not really limited by that, rather than both our ability to do it as opposed to our limited thinking of being able to do it at this point. And I guess probably because we are relatively new in the game in regards to doing restoration, that we actually have not had to move down that line of looking at it from a wetland that has been lost with the community and say, well, we're going to use your money now to do a river restoration over here, as opposed to saying we're going to do another wetland restoration someplace. But we may actually get there. We may have to go there. Looking at what are the opportunities for restoration may be more limited for wetlands than they are for some of the stream networks that have been heavily impacted in the past.
Yeah, and I would add just a quick example. One of the things I'm probably most proud of in my career in government was when in the San Francisco Bay Area, we came up with a ecosystems goals plan for restoring the San Francisco Bay. The situation was, and that's actually was more exciting than getting Clint Eastwood his golf course, so I want to say I'm really proud of that. But red-legged frogs was his problem. Anyway, what the situation we had in San Francisco Bay, we had lost 90% of our wetlands, but they've been converted, a lot of those, to seasonal wetlands. The problem was that anytime someone impacted a seasonal wetland, they were required to restore a seasonal wetland. So the three of us in the room with pizza, you as well, you're invited, and some beer, we could have come up with a restoration plan probably in about 2 hours. But being government, it took us about 3 years and about $5 million. But we came up with a reasonable plan that basically said, hey, look, our goal, we have all this endangered species related to tidal wetlands. Let's restore X amount of acres of tidal wetlands. And then we'll have so much amount of seasonal wetlands, which we believe need to support the species, and we'll do adaptive management to make sure we're meeting our goals. But then if someone impacted a seasonal wetland, we were actually requiring mitigation for tidal wetland to do a regional plan. And so if you're looking at lakes, streams, and rivers, you may need to make, and it's a tough thing because it's tough to make decisions today about tomorrow, but you may need to say, of our area, we would like to see so much percentage of lakes, so much of prairie potholes, ponds, and so much of riparian areas with floodplains and streams. And that would be the makeup we want. And we're going to develop a mitigation plan, an offset plan, that when we impact these areas, we're going to let people, rather than fight it for 2 or 3 years, we're going to let them go and mitigate at these areas, protect them. It might be preservation, but by doing so, we'll have the city of habitat and in the environment we want versus this fight over time.